Sometimes the loneliest souls find each other in the darkest places. Sometimes love comes not with passion, but with the simple act of seeing someone as they truly are. Lord Therion has lived alone in his stone keep for 300 years. The vampire lord fears nothing except the endless emptiness in his chest. When the kingdom sends Elira, a quiet servant woman, to his halls as punishment, she does something no one has done in centuries. She looks at him without fear. She speaks to him without trembling. And slowly, in the space between her gentle words and his ancient silence, his frozen heart begins to beat again. But when the kingdom demands her return for execution, Therion faces an impossible choice. Will he choose love, or let darkness win forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The obsidian signet ring caught what little light filtered through the cracked stone window, its ancient family crest worn smooth by centuries of restless turning. Lord Therion sat motionless in his chair, the heavy velvet drapes drawn against another dying day. 300 years had passed since he last felt the warmth of sunlight on his skin, yet time had become nothing more than an endless parade of shadows dancing across these same walls. The keep of Eld Hollow stood like a monument to forgotten glory, its towers reaching toward storm clouds that seemed permanently settled over the haunted woods. Once, these halls had rung with laughter and the music of grand celebrations. Now they echoed only with the whisper of wind through broken shutters and the distant cry of ravens that nested in the crumbling battlements. Therion's pale fingers traced the worn arms of his chair, remembering when these same hands had wielded sword and quill with equal grace. He had been Lord of Eld Hollow then, a nobleman of considerable influence whose word carried weight in the royal court. That man seemed like a stranger now, buried beneath centuries of isolation and the bitter taste of betrayal that had never quite faded from his tongue. The transformation from mortal lord to creature of darkness had not been his choice. Lady Morwen, with her raven hair and lips like poisoned wine, had promised him eternal love alongside eternal life. Instead, she had delivered eternal solitude when she abandoned him for another, taking with her not just his heart, but his last connection to the world of the living. The betrayal had cut deeper than the fangs that changed his nature. For decades, he had raged against his fate, using his newfound powers to strike fear into the hearts of those who dared venture near his domain. The kingdom learned to give Eld Hollow wide berth, and in return, he troubled them little. A mutual understanding born of fear and respect for boundaries that neither side cared to test. But rage, Therion had discovered, was a fire that eventually burned itself out. What remained was something far more dangerous than anger, emptiness. The hollow ache in his chest, where his heart had once beaten with human warmth, now served only to mark time with its steady, mechanical rhythm. He no longer remembered what it felt like to hope, to dream, to want anything beyond the simple passage of another meaningless night. The portraits lining the great hall bore witness to his transformation. Images of his ancestors, painted with loving detail by artists whose names had been lost to time, watched him with eyes that seemed to judge his fall from grace. Lord Aldrich the Bold, who had built this keep with his own hands and the sweat of loyal men. Lady Evangeline the Fair, whose diplomatic skills had prevented 3 wars and saved countless lives. Generation after generation of nobles who had used their power to protect and serve, while he had become nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered around tavern fires. The irony was not lost on him that the kingdom now sent him tribute in the form of servants, criminals, and outcasts deemed suitable for his dark purposes. They never lasted long. Most fled within days, too terrified to remain in the presence of something that should not exist. Those few who stayed did so out of desperation rather than courage, and their fear poisoned every interaction until even he grew weary of their trembling. Therion rose from his chair and walked to the window. pushing aside the heavy curtain to peer into the forest beyond. The woods of Eld Hollow stretched for miles in every direction, a maze of ancient oaks and twisted paths that discouraged travelers and hid secrets older than his own transformation. Local folklore claimed the trees themselves were cursed, that they whispered to those foolish enough to venture too deep into their shadows. Therion knew better. The only curse in these woods was his own presence, and the trees whispered nothing but the wind through their branches. A movement on the narrow road caught his attention. A solitary figure approached on foot, carrying what appeared to be a small bundle of possessions. Another servant, no doubt, sent to replace the last one who had fled in the night 3 months ago. He wondered absently how long this one would last. The record was held by an old man named Henrik, who had managed 2 full weeks before the weight of constant dread finally broke his resolve. Therion let the curtain fall and returned to his chair. The ritual never changed. They would arrive with fear already etched deep in their features, having heard every story the kingdom had to tell about the monster of Eld Hollow. They would perform their duties with hands that shook and eyes that never quite met his. They would sleep poorly, if at all, starting at every creak and groan of the ancient keep. And eventually they would break. The sound of the heavy front door echoing through the halls announced the newcomer's arrival. Therion listened to footsteps on stone, measured, steady, neither hurried nor hesitant. Interesting. Most arrivals either rushed to get the unpleasant business over with, or crept along like mice, hoping to avoid his notice. From his position in the study, he could hear movement in the servants' quarters as the new arrival settled in. No gasps of horror at the keep's gothic atmosphere, no whispered prayers for protection. The sounds were purely practical belongings being unpacked, furniture being arranged, the simple business of making a space habitable. Therion frowned. This was not the usual pattern. As evening deepened into true night, he made his way through the familiar corridors toward the kitchen. His enhanced senses picked up the scent of bread baking and something else, herbs, perhaps rosemary and thyme. The kitchen, when he reached it, was transformed. Where chaos had reigned since Henrik's departure, order now held sway. Pots hung in neat rows, the long table was scrubbed clean, and warmth emanated from the great hearth where a proper fire crackled. A woman stood with her back to him, tending something in a large pot over the fire. She was not young, her dark hair showed threads of silver, and her figure spoke of someone who had lived fully rather than merely existed. She wore simple brown wool, practical clothing that had seen honest work. When she turned to reach for a wooden spoon, he caught a glimpse of her profile, strong features softened by lines that suggested laughter rather than hardship, though he sensed she had known both. "You must be Lord Therion," she said, without turning around, her voice carrying the warm tone of someone addressing an equal rather than a master. "I'm Elira. I was told you prefer your meals served in the study, but the bread won't be ready for another hour. I hope that suits you." Therion stood perfectly still, momentarily stunned by this casual greeting. No trembling voice, no desperate formality, no obvious signs of terror, barely held in check. She spoke to him as she might speak to any employer on her first day of work. "You are not afraid," he said, the words emerging as observation rather than question. Elira finally turned to face him, and her steady brown eyes met his without flinching. They were kind eyes, he realized, but not naive. She had seen enough of the world to understand darkness when she encountered it, yet chose to meet it without cowering. "I've had worse masters than vampires," she said simply. "At least you're honest about what you are." The unexpected response drew something that might have been surprise from him, if he had still been capable of such emotions. Most servants either pretended not to know his nature, or spoke of it in hushed, terrified whispers. None had ever treated it as a simple fact to be acknowledged and set aside. "The previous servants did not share your pragmatic view," he observed. "The previous servants probably had something to live for," Elira replied, returning to her cooking. "I'm here because I have nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose." That makes a person considerably less concerned about the supernatural preferences of their employer. Therion studied her as she worked. Her movements were efficient and sure, speaking of someone accustomed to managing a household. Her hands bore the calluses of honest labor, and she carried herself with quiet dignity despite her circumstances. Most intriguing of all, her scent held no trace of fear, only the faint lavender soap she had used and the herbs she was cooking with. "What crime brought you to my service?" he asked. "Speaking truth to those who preferred lies," she answered without looking up. "A dangerous habit in royal courts, I'm told." The bitterness in her voice was slight but unmistakable. Therion recognized the tone of someone who had been betrayed by those they trusted, abandoned by those they served. It was a song he knew well. "Truth is indeed a dangerous commodity," he agreed. "Perhaps more dangerous than vampirism in some circles." Elira glanced at him then, and for a moment he saw something flicker in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. It was gone quickly, replaced by the polite attention of a servant to her master, but the moment lingered between them like an echo. "Your rooms are in the West Tower," he said. "Henrik cleaned them before he left. You'll find everything you need there." "Thank you, my lord. Will there be anything else tonight?" The formal question should have restored the proper distance between them, yet somehow it didn't. Perhaps it was the way she waited for his answer, with genuine attention rather than nervous dread, or the fact that she had made his kitchen feel like a place where people lived rather than merely survived. "No," he said finally. "Nothing else." He turned to leave, then paused. "Elira, that was your name?" "Yes, my lord. Welcome to Eld Hollow." As he made his way back to his study, Therion found himself thinking about brown eyes that held secrets and hands that showed no tremor when they served a monster his evening meal. For the first time, in longer than he cared to remember, the endless routine of his nights had been interrupted by something unexpected. Behind him, the scent of baking bread filled the ancient halls, and somewhere in the distance he could hear Elira humming a melody he almost remembered from his mortal days. The sound followed him through the corridors like a gentle ghost, and when he settled back into his chair with his book, he found his attention wandering from the familiar words on the page. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the haunted woods of Eld Hollow, but for the first time in centuries, the darkness within the keep felt somehow less absolute. The obsidian signet ring rested quietly on his finger, and Therion found himself wondering what tomorrow night might bring. The shattered mirror hung in Therion's private chamber like a monument to broken dreams. Once, the enchanted glass had shown his reflection in all its mortal glory, dark hair catching lamplight, eyes bright with ambition and hope. Now only jagged fragments remained, each piece reflecting a different angle of emptiness. He had destroyed it himself on the night he realized that 3 centuries had passed without a single moment of genuine happiness. 3 days had elapsed since Elira's arrival, and already the keep felt different. Not transformed, that would be too strong a word, but awakened somehow, as if rooms that had been holding their breath were finally learning to exhale. The kitchen remained warm well into the late hours. The great hall bore the scent of beeswax where she had polished the long table. Small things, practical improvements that nonetheless carried weight. Therion found himself listening for her footsteps in the corridors, the soft humming that accompanied her work, the quiet efficiency with which she moved through her daily routines. She rose before dawn and worked steadily until well past sunset, yet she never seemed hurried or harried. There was a peacefulness about her that puzzled him, not the forced calm of someone suppressing fear, but the genuine serenity of a person who had made peace with her circumstances. On the 4th morning, though, morning was merely a concept for him now. Marked by the gradual lightening behind heavy curtains, he made his way to the study to find Elira already there. She stood before the massive oak desk, carefully dusting the leather-bound volumes that lined the shelves behind it. Her movements were respectful, precise, treating his books as treasures rather than objects to be cleaned around. "You read Latin," she observed without turning. her finger tracing the gold lettering on an ancient spine. "Among other languages," he replied, genuinely surprised by her observation. "You recognize the script? My father was a scholar before he became a merchant," she said, finally facing him. "He insisted I learn to read properly, not just the simple words most women are taught. He said knowledge was the one thing no one could steal from you." She paused, her expression growing distant. He was wrong about that, as it turned out, but the reading remained useful. Therion moved closer, noting the way her fingers lingered on the books with obvious longing. "You may borrow anything that interests you," he said. "Most have been gathering dust for decades." The offer seemed to surprise her. "That's very generous, my lord. I wasn't expecting..." Expecting what? That a monster would have use for poetry and philosophy? The words emerged more sharply than he intended, carrying centuries of accumulated bitterness. Elira regarded him steadily, unfazed by his tone. "I was going to say I wasn't expecting such kindness from someone who has every reason to be bitter," she replied calmly. "But if you prefer to assume the worst of my intentions, that's your choice." The gentle rebuke struck him like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had challenged him, even so mildly? When had anyone spoken to him with such straightforward honesty? "You don't know what reasons I might have for bitterness," he said, though his voice had lost its edge. "No," she agreed. "I don't, but I know the look of someone who's been betrayed by those they trusted. I know the weight that settles in a person's shoulders when they've been abandoned by those who claim to love them. I've seen it in my own mirror often enough." Therion stared at her. This woman who saw too much and spoke with uncomfortable clarity. "You know nothing about my circumstances." "Perhaps not the details," Elira said, returning to her dusting. "But loneliness has a particular sound to it. These walls have been listening to it for a very long time." The observation cut deeper than any blade. He wanted to retreat, to end this conversation before it ventured into territory he had kept sealed for centuries. Instead, he found himself drawn forward by a curiosity he had thought long dead. "And what sound does your loneliness make?" he asked. Elira paused in her work, her hand resting on the spine of a volume of ancient poetry. For a moment, the careful composure she wore like armor seemed to waver. "Quieter than yours," she said finally. "I learned early that grief kept to oneself weighs less than grief shared with those who cannot understand it. Yet you speak of it to me," you asked. "And besides..." She turned to face him fully, and he saw something vulnerable flicker in her brown eyes. "Sometimes it's easier to be honest with someone who has nothing left to lose. You've already seen the worst the world can offer. My small sorrows won't shock you." Therion felt something shift in his chest, like ice beginning to crack under the pressure of rushing water. This woman, this servant, who should have been trembling in his presence, was offering him the gift of her trust. When had anyone last done such a thing? "Tell me," he said, the words emerging before he could stop them. Elira set down her dusting cloth and moved to the window, gazing out at the storm clouds that perpetually shrouded Eld Hollow. "I was married once. Thomas was a good man, kind, hard-working, devoted to our small plot of land and our hopes for children. We had 7 years together before the fever took him." Her voice remained steady, but Therion caught the slight tightening around her eyes that spoke of old pain carefully managed. "After his death, I went to live with his brother's family. They were generous enough to take me in, and I tried to be useful, to earn my keep through service. But Richard was ambitious, and he saw opportunity in my widow's status. He began arranging meetings with men who might take me as a wife, men who wanted a woman seasoned enough to manage a household, but young enough to bear children. You refused their advances?" "I refused the lies they built their courtships on," she said firmly. "Every one of them spoke of love while calculating the value of the small inheritance Thomas had left me. When I pointed out this discrepancy to Richard, he accused me of ingratitude." When I took my concerns to the local magistrate, I discovered that Richard had been taking bribes from several of my suitors to encourage my cooperation. Therion felt an unfamiliar heat building in his chest anger, but not the cold rage he had nursed for centuries. This was something warmer, more immediate, protective. You exposed the corruption? I tried to. I gathered evidence, documented the bribes, even convinced one of the suitors to confess his part in writing. But Richard had more influence than I realized, and more friends in high places. When I presented my case, I was accused of fabricating evidence to avoid my womanly duties. The magistrate declared me a disruptive influence on the natural order and sentenced me to service in a place where my rebellious nature could do no harm. To my keeping, to your keeping, she confirmed, though I suspect they thought I would last no longer than the previous servants. Perhaps they hoped the fear would cure me of my inconvenient honesty. Therion studied her profile as she continued to gaze out the window. There was no self-pity in her posture, no desperate plea for sympathy. She had simply answered his question with the same straightforward honesty she brought to everything else. "You spoke truth, and they punished you for it," he said. "As someone else was punished long ago, I suspect," she replied, glancing at him meaningfully. "The powerful have never liked being reminded of their failures." The parallel she drew hung between them like a bridge across the centuries that separated their experiences. Different circumstances, different times, but the same fundamental betrayal, trust, offered and returned with cruelty. "Lady Morwyn promised me eternal love," he said, the words escaping before he could censor them. "What she gave me was eternal solitude." Elira turned from the window to face him fully. "Then we are both refugees from the court of false promises," she said softly. The simple statement somehow carried more weight than any elaborate sympathy could have managed. In those few words, she had acknowledged his pain without diminishing it, recognized the magnitude of centuries of isolation without treating it as incomprehensible. For the first time since his transformation, Therion felt truly seen, not as a monster to be feared or a curiosity to be studied, but as a being capable of suffering, deserving of understanding. The sensation was overwhelming, terrifying in its intensity. He turned abruptly and strode toward the door, desperate to escape before this unexpected vulnerability could deepen further. "My lord?" Elira's voice followed him, concerned but not demanding. He paused at the threshold, his hand gripping the doorframe hard enough to crack the ancient wood. "Continue with your duties," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "I have other matters to attend to." As he fled through the corridors toward the sanctuary of his chambers, Therion could hear the soft sound of Elira returning to her work, humming that same haunting melody that seemed to follow him everywhere. The shattered mirror awaited him in his room, reflecting his fractured image in a dozen broken pieces. But for the first time in 3 centuries, he wondered if perhaps some things, once broken, could be made whole again. The ancient leather journal lay forgotten beneath a stack of ledgers in Therion's private study, its cover worn smooth by countless nights when younger hands had poured passion onto parchment. Inside, pressed between pages of faded ink, wildflowers from long-dead summers still held traces of their original color: purple violets, white daisies, yellow buttercups, gathered by a man who had believed love could conquer any obstacle. That man seemed like a stranger now, yet something about Elira's presence was awakening memories Therion had thought buried forever. The way she hummed while working reminded him of mortal evenings when music had filled these halls. Her gentle efficiency in managing the keep's decay brought back images of when Eld Hollow had been a living place, not a tomb. 5 days had passed since their conversation in the study, and Therion found himself emerging from his chambers with increasing frequency. Not to seek her company, he told himself that much, but simply because the corridors no longer felt quite so empty. Her presence had brought subtle changes that accumulated like snowfall, barely noticeable individually, but transformative in their totality. The kitchen now served as the heart of the keep rather than merely a functional necessity. Herbs grew in small pots on the windowsill, filling the air with the scents of rosemary and thyme. The great hearth was maintained with care, its fire providing warmth that seemed to extend far beyond the kitchen walls. Even the servants' quarters had been transformed from Henrik's sparse accommodations into something approaching a proper home. Therion discovered this last change by accident, passing the west tower on his way to the battlements. Through the open door, he glimpsed colourful quilts on the narrow bed, a small table set with wildflowers in a clay pitcher, and his books arranged neatly on a makeshift shelf. The sight stopped him in his tracks. When had anyone last made a home within these walls? My lord? Elira appeared in the doorway, having noticed his lingering presence. She wore a simple grey dress, practical but clean, and her silver-streaked hair was braided back in a manner that suggested both efficiency and quiet pride in her appearance. "I was merely passing," he said, feeling oddly like an intruder, despite being master of the keep. "Would you like to see what I've done with the room?" she asked, stepping aside to invite him in. "I hope you don't mind that I borrowed a few volumes. The evenings are long, and reading helps me sleep." Therion hesitated at the threshold. The room felt intensely personal, marked by small touches that spoke of someone who had learned to create comfort wherever she found herself. The clay pitcher was clearly her own possession, as were the quilts that added warmth and colour to the austere space. "You've made it welcoming," he said finally, stepping inside. "I had forgotten rooms could feel this way." Elira smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. "A room is just walls until someone decides to live in it rather than merely occupy it," she said. "I learned that lesson during my marriage. Thomas used to say I could make a barn feel like a palace if I set my mind to it." The mention of her deceased husband should have created distance between them, yet somehow it didn't. Instead, Therion found himself curious about the man who had earned such obvious devotion. "Tell me about him," he said, surprising himself with the request. Elira moved to the small window, her fingers trailing along the stone sill where her herb pots caught the last light of day. He was steady in the way that truly good people are, not exciting perhaps, but absolutely reliable. When he gave his word, you could build your life on it. When he loved completely. She paused, and Therion saw her expression soften with memory. "He would have liked you, I think. He always said that people who had known real suffering were capable of the greatest kindness if they chose to be." "I am not kind," Therion said automatically. "Aren't you?" Elira turned from the window to face him. "You've given me safe shelter, meaningful work, access to books I treasure, and freedom to speak honestly without fear of punishment. You've shown more consideration for my well-being in 5 days than my own family managed in 2 years. What would you call that?" The observation unsettled him. He had simply treated her as he would wish to be treated, with basic dignity and respect. That such simple courtesy should qualify as kindness spoke poorly of the world that had shaped her expectations. "Perhaps I have simply forgotten how to be otherwise," he said. "Or perhaps you remember better than you think," she replied gently. Their conversation was interrupted by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the keep. Rain began pelting the windows with renewed fury, and Elira moved to close the shutters against the storm. "These autumn tempests grow fiercer each year," she murmured, struggling with a warped shutter that refused to latch properly. Without thinking, Therion moved to help her, his greater height allowing him to reach the troublesome latch. As he worked to secure it, he became acutely aware of her proximity, the warmth radiating from her body, the subtle scent of lavender soap that clung to her skin, the way her breathing quickened slightly when his arm brushed against her shoulder. "There," he said, stepping back quickly. "That should hold against the wind." "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I'm not quite tall enough to manage the upper latches on my own." The practical statement hung in the air between them, somehow carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. Therion found himself studying her face in the lamplight, noting details he had previously overlooked: the warmth in her brown eyes, the gentle curve of her lips, the way her presence seemed to fill the small room with something that felt dangerously like peace. "I should return to my chambers," he said, though he made no immediate move toward the door. "Of course," Elira agreed. Yet she, too, remained still. "Though you're welcome to borrow a book if you'd like. I noticed you looking at the poetry collection." She was right. His gaze had lingered on the slim volume of verse he had not opened in decades. The fact that she had observed his interest and remembered it spoke to an attentiveness that both pleased and unnerved him. "Another time, perhaps," he said, finally forcing himself toward the door. "The storm should pass by morning. Sleep well, Elira." "Good night, my lord," she replied, and again he heard that lack of formality that suggested she saw him as something more than merely a master to be feared. As he made his way through the darkened corridors, Therion found his thoughts returning to her words about kindness, about people who had known suffering, choosing to be gentle rather than cruel. The concept seemed foreign after centuries of isolation, yet something about her presence made it feel possible. In his own chambers, surrounded by the familiar shadows and silence, he pulled the forgotten journal from its hiding place beneath the ledgers. The pressed flowers crumbled at his touch, but their faint perfume still clung to the pages. His own handwriting, young and passionate, filled the margins with declarations of love and dreams of a future that had never come to pass. For the first time in 3 centuries, those dreams no longer seemed like mockery. Outside his window, the storm raged against the ancient stones of Eld Hollow, but within the keep, something warmer than fire was beginning to chase away the perpetual chill that had settled in his bones. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask Elira about the book she was reading. The thought brought with it an unfamiliar sensation, anticipation. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to look forward to something. The moonstone pendant caught the firelight as Elira moved about the kitchen, its simple silver chain gleaming against the dark fabric of her dress. It was nothing elaborate, a modest piece that spoke of sentimental rather than monetary value. Yet Therion found his gaze drawn to it repeatedly as they shared their evening meal. The way it captured and reflected the light reminded him of stars glimpsed through storm clouds, small points of brightness in an otherwise dark sky. 2 weeks had passed since the night of the fierce storm, and their interactions had settled into something that felt almost like companionship. Elira had taken to serving his dinner in the kitchen rather than the formal dining hall, claiming the hearth provided better light for her evening mending. Therion had not objected to the arrangement. The kitchen's warmth was more appealing than the echoing emptiness of the great hall, and her quiet presence made the act of dining feel less like a solitary ritual. "You mentioned your father was a scholar," Therion said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "What was his field of study?" Elira looked up from her bowl of soup, her expression brightening with the pleasure of speaking about someone she had clearly loved. "History, primarily, ancient civilizations and their customs. He was fascinated by the way people in different times and places found meaning in their lives." She reached up to touch the pendant absently, a gesture Therion was beginning to recognize as a sign that she was thinking of something important. "This was his first gift to my mother when they were courting, nothing valuable by most standards, but he said the moonstone reminded him of her, beautiful in its simplicity and capable of finding light even in darkness." The words struck Therion with unexpected force. When had anyone last described him or his circumstances in terms of light rather than shadow? "Your mother must have treasured it," he said carefully. "She did. She wore it every day until the fever took her, and then it came to me. Sometimes I think it carries a bit of their love along with it." Elira smiled softly, though her eyes held the distant quality that always accompanied mentions of her lost family. "Thomas used to tease me about it, said I talked to it like it could hear me." "Perhaps it can," Therion said, the words emerging before he could consider their wisdom. Elira's eyes met his across the table, and he saw surprise flicker there, not at the suggestion itself, but at the gentle tone with which he had offered it. In that moment, something shifted between them, a deepening of the careful friendship they had been building. "Do you believe in such things?" she asked. "Objects holding memories, carrying pieces of the people who loved them?" Therion considered the question seriously. "I have lived long enough to know that the world contains mysteries that logic cannot explain," he said finally. "Love, in particular, seems to leave traces in unexpected places." The admission hung between them, more personal than anything he had shared since that first conversation in his study. Elira regarded him with an expression he could not quite read, thoughtful perhaps, or curious. "What traces has love left in your life?" she asked gently. The question should have triggered his usual retreat into cold formality. Instead, Therion found himself considering it honestly. "Scars, mostly," he said, "and questions about whether I ever truly understood what love meant." "That suggests you're wiser now than you were then," Elira observed. "True understanding often comes only after we've learned what love is not." Her words carried the weight of her own experience, and Therion realized that she too had been disappointed by those who claimed to care for her. The recognition created a bridge between their very different sorrows. "Tell me about your marriage," he said. "Not the ending, but the beginning. What did love feel like when it was real?" Elira's expression softened, and she was quiet for so long that Therion began to think she would not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice held the warmth of cherished memory. "Safe," she said simply. "Thomas made me feel safe in ways I hadn't even realized I needed. Not because he was particularly strong or powerful, but because I never doubted his intentions. When he said he would do something, he did it. When he promised to care for me, he meant it completely." She paused, her fingers again finding the pendant. There was peace in that certainty. I could be entirely myself with him, all my thoughts, my fears, my silly dreams about making our little cottage into something beautiful. He listened to everything as if it mattered. Therion felt a pang of something that might have been envy. "I have never known such acceptance," he admitted. "Perhaps because you've never offered it to yourself," Elira said softly. "It's difficult to believe others could accept us when we haven't learned to be gentle with our own shortcomings." The observation cut deeper than any accusation could have. How long had it been since he had shown himself any mercy for the choices that led to his transformation, for the centuries of bitterness that followed, for the fear he inspired in others? "Self-forgiveness is a luxury I cannot afford," he said. "The consequences of my nature are too severe." "Are they?" Elira leaned forward slightly, her brown eyes intent. "Or have you convinced yourself they must be, because the alternative, believing you deserve compassion, feels too dangerous?" Therion stared at her, this woman who saw through centuries of carefully constructed defenses as if they were made of glass. Her directness should have angered him, yet he felt only a strange sense of relief at being so thoroughly understood. "You ask dangerous questions," he said. "I've always had that failing," she replied with a slight smile. "Thomas used to say I could find the heart of any matter and poke at it until it revealed itself completely. Not always a comfortable trait in a wife, but a valuable one in a friend," Therion said, the word friend emerging before he could stop it. Elira's smile deepened, and for the first time since her arrival he saw genuine happiness in her features. "Yes," she agreed. "I would like very much to be your friend, Therion." The use of his name without title should have been presumptuous, yet it felt natural coming from her lips. When had anyone last spoken his name with such warmth? "And I yours, Elira," he replied, surprised by how much he meant it. Outside, winter wind howled through the bare branches of the haunted woods, but inside the kitchen the fire crackled warmly, and two unlikely souls continued their careful exploration of what it meant to trust again. The moonstone pendant caught the light as Elira laughed at something he said, and Therion realized that for the first time in centuries he was not merely enduring the passage of time, he was living in it. The ancient keep of Eld Hollow had witnessed many things across the ages, but perhaps none so remarkable as this: a monster learning to remember his humanity, and a woman teaching him that even the darkest souls could find their way back to the light. The silver music box sat open on Therion's desk, its delicate melody filling the study with haunting beauty. He had not wound it in over a century, yet tonight he found himself drawn to its bittersweet song, a waltz from his mortal days when dancing had been as natural as breathing. The tiny figures within spun endlessly, a lord and lady frozen in eternal embrace, their painted faces worn smooth by time and countless rotations. 3 weeks had passed since he and Elira had declared their friendship, and the admission had changed something fundamental between them. The careful politeness had given way to genuine ease, their conversations flowing with the natural rhythm of two minds that found pleasure in each other's company. Yet, with this comfort came a deeper vulnerability that left Therion feeling simultaneously grateful and terrified. Elira entered the study carrying a tea service, her movements graceful despite the weight of the silver tray. She had taken to joining him for evening conversation after her duties were complete, their talks ranging from literature to philosophy to the small observations that made daily life meaningful. "I haven't heard that melody in years," she said, setting the tray on a small table near the fire. "My grandmother had a music box very similar to this one. She used to say the song could call back the spirits of those who had danced to it." Therion watched the spinning figures, remembering nights when these halls had echoed with laughter and music. "I danced to this waltz on the night I proposed to Lady Morwen," he said, the words emerging without his conscious intention. Elira paused in pouring the tea, but her expression remained carefully neutral. "Tell me about her," she said gently. "What was she like before the betrayal?" The question surprised him. Most people, on the rare occasions when his past was discussed, focused on the dramatic elements, the transformation, the abandonment, the centuries of isolation that followed. Elira was asking about the woman who had once inspired love, not just the one who had destroyed it. "Beautiful, obviously," he said, accepting the cup she offered. "But more than that, brilliant. She had a mind that could grasp complex ideas and see connections others missed. When she spoke, people listened. When she entered a room, the very air seemed to change." He paused, watching steam rise from his tea. "I was young enough then to confuse intensity with depth. Her passion seemed like proof of a great heart, when perhaps it was simply evidence of a restless spirit that would never be satisfied with any one person or place." Elira settled into the chair across from him, her brown eyes thoughtful. "What drew her to you? Power, I think, or the promise of it?" Therion's laugh held no humour. "I was heir to considerable lands, well connected at court, ambitious enough to be useful to her plans. She saw potential in me that I was too infatuated to recognize as manipulation. But surely there was more than calculation on her part," Elira said. "People don't sustain elaborate deceptions without some foundation of genuine feeling." Her generosity toward someone who had caused him such pain struck Therion as remarkably characteristic. Even in discussing his greatest betrayal, Elira sought to understand rather than condemn. "Perhaps," he admitted, "there were moments when I believed what we shared was real. She would look at me with such intensity, speak of our future with such conviction, that I felt as though I could conquer kingdoms for her smile. That feeling was real, even if her motives were not," Elira observed. "Your love was true, regardless of whether hers was." The distinction had never occurred to him in quite those terms. For centuries he had treated his love for Morwen as foolishness, evidence of his naivety and poor judgment. Elira's words suggested a different interpretation, that perhaps there had been honor in loving completely, even if that love had been misplaced. "She offered me immortality as a gift," he continued. eternal life so that our love could transcend mortal limitations. I was too besotted to question her sudden urgency, her insistence that the transformation must happen immediately. "What changed?" Elira asked softly. "Lord Aldwyn arrived at court with his vast estates and his ancient bloodline," Therion said, his voice growing flat. "Within a fortnight, she had transferred her affections to him. When I confronted her, she laughed, said I had served my purpose, but that she required a consort worthy of her ambitions. The memory still carried the power to wound, though the pain had dulled from a blade's edge to a deep ache. Elira's presence somehow made it possible to speak of it without the rage that usually accompanied such recollections. "She left you transformed and alone," Elira said, not a question but a statement of understanding. "More than alone," Therion replied, "cut off from everything I had been. The vampire nature made it impossible to maintain my previous life, my position at court, my connections to family and friends. She had given me eternity and taken away everything that might have made it bearable." Elira was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the spinning figures in the music box. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality of gentle certainty that surprised him. "She was a fool," she said simply. Therion looked up sharply. "Because she chose poorly in abandoning me. Because she had the love of an honorable man and threw it away for the promise of greater advantage," Elira said firmly. "Because she transformed someone she claimed to care for into something that would suffer, then abandoned them to face that suffering alone. Because she confused genuine worth with social position and chose flash over substance." The fierce defense in her voice stirred something warm in Therion's chest. When had anyone last spoken of him in terms of honor and worth? When had anyone suggested that Morwen's choice reflected poorly on her rather than on him? "You speak as though you knew us both," he said, attempting lightness. "I know you," Elira replied, meeting his gaze directly. "And I can see what she lost when she chose ambition over love. Her loss became my unexpected gain." The words hung between them, carrying implications that made Therion's breath catch. There was no mistaking her meaning. She valued what they had found together, considered his friendship a treasure rather than a burden. "Elira," he began, but she held up a gentle hand. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I simply wanted you to know that her blindness was not a reflection of your worth. Some people are constitutionally unable to recognize true value when they encounter it." The music box continued its haunting melody, the painted figures spinning in their eternal dance. But for the first time since he had wound it as a young man in love, Therion heard not mockery in its song, but possibility. Perhaps some dances could begin again, even after the music had stopped for centuries. Outside, winter deepened around Eld Hollow, but inside the study, two souls drew closer to a warmth neither had expected to find again. The blood rose bloomed in defiance of winter's grip, its deep crimson petals unfurling in the perpetual shadows of Eld Hollow's overgrown garden. It was a rare flower, one that found beauty only in darkness, thriving where other plants withered and died. Therion had discovered it during his restless wandering through the keep's grounds, drawn by memories of when these gardens had been carefully tended and full of life. Now he stood beside Elira in the kitchen, watching her face as she examined the extraordinary bloom he had brought her. The firelight caught the subtle variations in its colouring deep wine at the base of each petal, brightening to rose at the edges, with veins of silver threading through like captured moonbeams. "It's magnificent," she breathed, cradling the stem with reverent care. "I've never seen anything like it. Where did it grow?" "In the old garden near the stone bench where my mother used to sit," Therion said, surprised by the ease with which he shared the memory. "They say blood roses bloom only for those who understand that beauty can emerge from the darkest circumstances." Elira's eyes met his, and he saw recognition there, understanding of what he was truly offering her. Not merely a flower, but acknowledgement of what they had found together in this place of shadows and solitude. "Then it was meant for me to find," she said softly, bringing the rose to her face to inhale its subtle fragrance. Or perhaps for us both. The word us hung in the air between them, weighted with significance neither had dared voice until now. 4 weeks had passed since her arrival, and what had begun as servant and master had transformed into something far more precious and infinitely more dangerous. Therion watched as she arranged the rose in a simple glass vase, placing it where the firelight would best illuminate its extraordinary beauty. Her movements were graceful, deliberate, carrying the same care she brought to all her tasks. Yet there was something different tonight, a heightened awareness in her posture, a flush in her cheeks that spoke of emotions carefully held in check. "Elira," he said, his voice rougher than intended, "what are we doing?" She turned from the vase to face him fully, and he saw his own confused longing reflected in her brown eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "I only know that I look forward to these evenings with you more than anything else in my life. That your presence has become necessary to my peace of mind. That when you're not here, these rooms feel empty despite all my efforts to make them warm." The honesty in her words struck him like a physical blow. Here was the truth he had been avoiding, spoken with the same straightforward courage she brought to everything else. "You know what I am," he said, though the words felt inadequate. "What I could become if my nature asserted itself. The danger you would face, the isolation you would endure. A life with me would be no life at all. Wouldn't it?" Elira stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, see the steady pulse at the base of her throat. "These past weeks have been the most alive I've felt since Thomas died. You've given me purpose, intellectual companionship, genuine friendship. You've treated me with more respect and consideration than my own family ever managed." "That is friendship," Therion said desperately. "What I feel for you goes far beyond such safe boundaries." "I know," she said simply. "I feel it too. This pull between us that grows stronger with each passing day. This sense that we were meant to find each other despite all the reasons why we should remain separate." The admission broke something open in his chest, releasing emotions he had kept locked away for centuries. Love, yes, but more than that, hope, protectiveness, the desperate desire to be worthy of the trust she was offering. "If I allowed myself to love you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I would never let anything harm you. But I am the greatest threat you could face. My very nature is violence, predation, darkness. How can I ask you to tie your life to such contradiction?" Elira reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his cold skin. "Because you don't ask," she said gently. "You offer. You present me with choice rather than demand submission. You worry about my welfare rather than your own desires. That is not the behavior of a monster, Therion. That is the behavior of a man who has learned to love wisely." Her touch was electric, sending warmth through his entire being. For a moment, he allowed himself to lean into her hand, to accept the comfort she offered so freely. "What if the kingdom recalls you?" he asked, voicing the fear that had begun to haunt his days. "What if they decide your punishment has been sufficient and demand your return?" "Then we will face that when it comes," Elira said firmly. "But I will not live in fear of tomorrow, when today offers such unexpected joy." "Joy," he repeated, tasting the word like wine. "I had forgotten that such a thing was possible." "As had I," she admitted. "Thomas gave me contentment, security, companionship. What I feel with you is different, more dangerous perhaps, but also more alive. You challenge me to think more deeply, feel more fully, be more than I ever imagined I could become." The space between them seemed to shimmer with possibility and peril in equal measure. Therion knew that to cross that final boundary would change everything, would make their connection irreversible and absolute. Yet the pull toward her was becoming stronger than his carefully maintained control. "Elira," he said, her name a prayer and a plea. "I know," she whispered. "I know what you're asking and what you're afraid to ask. I know the choice you're offering me, and I know what my answer will be. But not tonight. Tonight, let us simply be grateful for what we've already found. Tomorrow will bring its own decisions." The wisdom in her words steadied him, even as her proximity continued to test his resolve. She was right. They had time to explore these feelings carefully, to understand the full implications of what they were contemplating. "You make me want to be more than I am," he said finally. "You already are more than you know," she replied, her hand still resting against his cheek. "You're the man who brings me blood roses because he knows I find beauty in unlikely places. You're the friend who listens to my stories and shares his own painful truths. You're the protector who would sacrifice everything for my safety, even if it meant losing me forever." In the dancing firelight, with the blood rose glowing like a captured star between them, Therion felt something he had thought lost forever, the possibility of a future worth living. Not merely existing through the endless progression of nights, but truly living with purpose and passion and the miracle of being completely known by another soul. Outside, winter winds whispered through the haunted woods, but inside the kitchen, love was taking root in the darkest soil, promising blooms as rare and beautiful as the flower that had brought them to this moment of perfect understanding. The royal execution decree arrived on a morning when frost painted the windows of Eld Hollow in delicate patterns that reminded Therion of lace. The parchment bore the king's official seal, crimson wax, pressed with the crowned lion of the realm, and its ornate script demanded immediate attention with the authority of absolute power. Therion read it once, twice, then a third time, each reading confirming the nightmare that had suddenly crashed into their carefully constructed sanctuary. Elira was summoned to return within 7 days for public execution. The crime, sedition, corrupting the natural order, and spreading dangerous ideas among the common folk. The evidence, testimony from her brother-in-law, Richard, who claimed she had attempted to poison several respectable suitors and had threatened violence against local magistrates. All lies, of course. But lies wrapped in legal language and stamped with royal authority carried more weight than truth spoken by a condemned woman. Therion's hands trembled with rage as he read the final paragraph, which outlined the consequences should Elira fail to present herself as commanded. The king's forces would march on Eld Hollow, and any who harbored the fugitive would be considered enemies of the crown. The implicit threat was clear: surrender Elira or face destruction. "My lord," Elira's voice came from the doorway, concerned by his prolonged silence. She had been tending to the morning fire when the royal messenger arrived, and traces of ash still dusted her hands. "What news from the capital?" Therion looked up at her, this woman who had brought light into his darkness, who had taught him to hope again after centuries of despair, and felt his heart shatter like glass. How could he tell her that their time together was measured now in days, rather than the lifetime he had begun to imagine? "Sit down," he said, his voice carefully controlled. Something in his tone made her move immediately to the chair across from his desk, her face growing pale as she read the gravity in his expression. "They want me back," she said, not a question but a statement of terrible understanding. "Yes." He handed her the decree, watching her face as she read the charges against her. Her expression grew progressively more stunned, then angry, then resigned in a way that broke his heart completely. "Richard has been thorough," she said finally, setting the parchment aside. "Poison and threats of violence, crimes that would justify execution and ensure I could never again speak against his corruption." "None of it is true," Therion said fiercely. "Truth has never mattered in situations like these," Elira replied with bitter wisdom. "Richard has money and influence. I have neither. The outcome was determined the moment I spoke against him." Therion rose from his chair and began pacing, his mind racing through possibilities and finding each one more impossible than the last. "We could flee tonight. I know passages through the mountains that would take us beyond the king's reach. We could find sanctuary in the northern territories." "No," Elira's voice was quiet but firm. "You know I cannot run." "Why not?" The words exploded from him with desperate force. "What loyalty do you owe to a kingdom that has treated you so unjustly? What honor is there in walking willingly to your death?" Elira stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the frost-covered gardens where the blood rose still bloomed despite winter's grip. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had already made peace with an impossible choice. "Because if I run, they will come here," she said. "They will destroy this place and everyone in it. Because you would be branded an enemy of the crown, hunted for the rest of your very long existence. Because my flight would confirm their lies about my character and give them justification for even greater cruelties." "I care nothing for their opinions or their threats," Therion said, moving to stand behind her. "Let them come. Let them try to take you from me. They will learn what it means to threaten something I hold precious. And prove to them that you are indeed the monster they believe you to be." Elira turned to face him, her brown eyes bright with unshed tears. "Give them cause to raise armies against you, to turn you into the villain of stories told around every hearth in the kingdom. I will not be the reason you lose yourself to the darkness again." The quiet strength in her refusal struck him harder than any blow could have. She was protecting him, even now, even facing her own death. The realization filled him with a love so fierce it was almost unbearable. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "Some legal recourse, some appeal to higher authority." "The decree bears the king's personal seal," Elira pointed out gently. "There is no higher authority to petition, and even if there were, what evidence could I present? Richard has had months to perfect his story, to gather witnesses who will swear to whatever he requires. I have only my word against the testimony of respectable men." Therion felt the walls of possibility closing around them like a trap. For centuries, his power had been enough to protect what mattered to him. Now, faced with the complex machinery of legal persecution, that power seemed meaningless. "I will not let them take you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I will not lose you. Not when I have just learned what it means to truly live again." Elira reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle despite the trembling in her fingers. "You will not lose me," she said firmly. "Whatever happens, you will carry me with you always. These weeks together have changed us both forever. That cannot be undone by any king's decree." "That is not enough," Therion said desperately. "I want years with you, decades. I want to show you the world beyond these walls, to give you everything you deserve. I want to wake each evening knowing you are safe and loved and free to be exactly who you are." "And I want the same," Elira admitted, tears finally spilling over to track down her cheeks. "But wanting does not always align with what is possible. Sometimes love means accepting what we cannot change." "No." The word emerged as a growl, carrying centuries of accumulated rage. "Love means fighting for what matters, no matter the cost. It means refusing to surrender to injustice simply because the odds are poor." Something flickered in Elira's eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition of a strength she had not expected from him. "What are you thinking?" she asked carefully. Therion moved away from her, his mind already working through the implications of the desperate plan forming in his thoughts. "I am thinking that you are right about one thing: you cannot run from this accusation. But perhaps you do not need to. I don't understand. What if the charges against you were proven false? What if Richard's corruption was exposed publicly, his witnesses discredited, his motives revealed for what they truly are? What if the king himself was forced to acknowledge that grave injustice has been done?" Elira stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to comprehension to fear. "Therion, what you're suggesting, it would require you to leave Eldhollow, to involve yourself in court politics, to risk exposure and persecution. The danger to you would be enormous." "Less than the danger of losing you," he said simply. "I have power, Elira. Not just the supernatural strength of my nature, but knowledge, connections, resources accumulated over centuries. I have been hiding in these shadows for too long, convinced that isolation was safety. Perhaps it is time I remembered what those gifts were meant to accomplish. You would do this for me. The question carried wonder and terror in equal measure. Therion understood her fear. What he was proposing would change everything, would end forever the quiet sanctuary they had built together. But the alternative was unthinkable. I would do this for justice, he corrected gently, for truth, for the principle that innocence should not be sacrificed to corruption. And yes, I would do it for love, for the chance to build a life with you that extends beyond these 7 days. Elira was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if memorizing every detail. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality of fierce pride that made his heart soar. "Then we go together," she said. "If you mean to fight this battle, you will not fight it alone. They want me to return? Very well, but I return with the most dangerous ally they could possibly imagine." Outside, winter wind rattled the windows of Eld Hollow, but inside the study, 2 souls prepared to face the storm together, their love transformed from gentle sanctuary into weapon of terrible purpose. The ancestral sword of Eld Hollow gleamed in the candlelight, its blade untarnished despite centuries of disuse. Ancient runes ran along the fuller, their meaning lost to time, but their power still palpable in the weight of the weapon. Therion lifted it from its place of honor above the great hearth, feeling the familiar balance that spoke of master craftsmanship and noble purpose. His ancestors had carried this blade in defense of justice and protection of the innocent. Now it would serve those causes once again. 2 days had passed since the decree arrived, and Eld Hollow buzzed with focused activity. Therion had spent hours in correspondence, reaching out to contacts he had not spoken with in decades, calling in favors accumulated over centuries of careful observation and occasional intervention. The vampire lord of Eld Hollow had resources beyond what most imagined wealth, hidden in distant banks, allies who owed their lives or fortunes to his discretion, information gathered during long nights when others thought themselves unobserved. The royal architect confirms that modifications to the treasury vault were completed last spring, Elira said, entering the armory with a collection of documents spread across a wooden tray. The timing matches perfectly with when Richard's testimony claims I was plotting sedition in my brother-in-law's household. She had thrown herself into their preparations with fierce determination, her keen intelligence proving invaluable in organizing the evidence they would need. Her knowledge of Richard's business dealings, combined with Therion's network of informants, was revealing a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond simple bribery. "What about the magistrate?" Therion asked, securing the sword at his side. "Lord Blackwood has gambling debts that would ruin him if made public," Elira replied, setting down the tray. "Debts that were mysteriously forgiven within days of my sentencing." The creditor was an agent acting on Richard's behalf. Therion nodded grimly. The web of conspiracy was more extensive than they had initially realized, involving not just Richard's greed, but a network of corrupt officials who had perverted justice for personal gain. Exposing it would require careful strategy and considerable risk. "Are you certain about this course of action?" he asked, studying her face for any sign of doubt. "Once we enter the capital, there will be no retreat. If our plan fails, the consequences will be swift and final." Elira moved to stand before him, her brown eyes steady and determined. "I have been certain of nothing in my life except this," she said firmly. "Richard and his allies have built their power on the silence of those they've wronged. It ends now." Her courage humbled him. She was walking willingly into the den of those who wanted her dead, armed with nothing but truth and the support of a creature most would consider more dangerous than her accusers. Yet she faced the prospect with calm resolve that reminded him why he had fallen in love with her. "There is one more matter we must discuss." Therion said, his voice growing serious. My nature will be impossible to hide completely during our time at court. There will be those who recognize what I am, who will attempt to use that knowledge against us. Let them try, Elira said with surprising ferocity. You are not the monster in this story, Therion. That distinction belongs to those who would execute an innocent woman to protect their secrets. Her faith in him was both gift and burden. He had spent so many centuries convinced of his own darkness that her unwavering belief in his essential goodness sometimes felt like a weight too precious to bear. Promise me something, he said, reaching up to touch the moonstone pendant that rested at her throat. If events turn against us, if it becomes clear that our cause is lost, you will allow me to ensure your escape. Your life is worth more than any victory we might achieve. Only if you promise the same, she replied, covering his hand with hers. I will not purchase my freedom with your destruction. We succeed together, or we fail together. The pact settled between them with the weight of sacred vows. Whatever came next, they would face it as equals, each protecting the other with fierce devotion. A knock at the great door interrupted their moment. Therion's enhanced senses identified their visitor before the servant announced him Lord Marcus Ashworth, an old ally whose loyalty had been tested and proven across decades of discreet cooperation. My lord, Marcus said as he entered the armory, his weathered face grave with concern. I received your message and came as quickly as discretion allowed. The situation at court is worse than you described in your letter. Therion clasped his friend's hand in greeting, noting the genuine worry in the older man's expression. Marcus had served as his eyes and ears in the capital for years, providing information about political developments that might affect Eldhollow's isolation. Explain, Therion said simply. Richard has been busy since the decree was issued, Marcus reported. He's spread word that you have been harboring a dangerous criminal, that your protection of her proves you are a threat to the realm's stability. There are voices calling for military action against Eldhollow itself. Elira drew a sharp breath, but Therion felt only cold determination settle in his chest. They seek to paint me as the villain to justify whatever actions they plan. Worse than that, Marcus continued, they're using your reputation to terrify the common people. Stories are spreading about the vampire lord who steals women from their proper duties, who corrupts the innocent with dark magic. Richard has turned your love for Elira into evidence of supernatural evil. The calculated nature of the attack impressed Therion even as it enraged him. Richard understood that the court would be more willing to believe in monstrous vampires than mundane corruption. By making their love story into a tale of dark seduction, he had shifted the narrative from his crimes to their supposed sins. What of our evidence? Elira asked. Can Lord Ashworth help us present it to the proper authorities? Marcus's expression grew even more troubled. That is the other problem, my lady. The king has appointed a special tribunal to hear your case, comprised entirely of nobles who owe Richard significant favors. They have no interest in examining evidence that might implicate their benefactor. Then we bypass the tribunal, Therion said decisively. We take our case directly to the king himself. Impossible, Marcus protested. You would never gain an audience. Your reputation precedes you, and the court fears. They fear what they do not understand, Therion interrupted. But I am not without allies in unexpected places. The king's own daughter owes her life to my intervention during the plague years. Princess Catherine has not forgotten that debt. Marcus stared at him in amazement. You saved the princess? When? How? 20 years ago, when the red fever swept through the capital, Therion explained. I possessed knowledge of treatments that mortal physicians lacked. I provided them anonymously, through intermediaries, but Catherine discovered the truth. She has been quietly supportive of Eldhollow ever since. She would speak for us? Elira asked, hope flickering in her voice. She would listen, Therion corrected, which is more than we can expect from the tribunal. If we can present our evidence to someone who desires justice rather than political advantage, we might achieve the fair hearing that has been denied. The three of them spent the next hours refining their strategy, identifying the evidence that would be most compelling, anticipating the arguments their enemies would raise. As they worked, Therion found himself watching Elira with growing admiration. Her mind was sharp and methodical, her questions insightful, her determination unwavering. She had transformed from victim to warrior, and he felt his love for her deepen with each passing moment. "There is one more resource we should consider," Marcus said as evening approached. "The chronicler Simon has been documenting court corruption for years, waiting for someone with the courage to act on his evidence. If we could gain his support, we will have documentation spanning decades," Therion finished. "Evidence that Richard's crimes are part of a larger pattern of abuse." "Exactly. But approaching Simon carries its own risks. If word reaches our enemies that we have such extensive evidence, they will act more quickly to silence us," Elira said grimly. "We must be prepared for them to accelerate their timeline." Therion felt the familiar weight of the ancestral sword at his side, its presence both comfort and reminder of the battles his family had fought across generations. Tomorrow, they would leave the sanctuary of Eld Hollow and enter a world that viewed their love as corruption and their quest for justice as rebellion. But tonight, in the flickering candlelight of the armory, surrounded by the weapons and banners of his noble heritage, Therion felt something he had not experienced in centuries, the righteous certainty of a cause worth fighting for. He had power, he had purpose, and most importantly, he had love worth defending against any enemy. "Tomorrow we ride for the capital," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of ancient lordship. "Tonight, we rest and prepare our hearts for battle. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Outside, storm clouds gathered over the haunted woods of Eld Hollow, but inside the keep, two souls prepared to challenge the kingdom itself in the name of justice and the transformative power of love that refused to be silenced. The crown of shadows materialized from Therion's private vault like a fragment of midnight given form, its obsidian surface drinking in the lamplight, while silver veins pulsed with ancient power. He had not worn the relic since his transformation, when its weight had seemed like mockery of everything he had lost. Now, as he placed it upon his brow in the pre-dawn darkness, it felt like the reclamation of purpose long denied. The capital city of Valdris spread before them as their carriage crested the final hill, its towers and spires gleaming in the morning sun like a jeweled crown. Therion felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and disgust that always accompanied his rare visits to the seat of royal power. So much beauty built upon foundations of corruption and compromise, so much grandeur masking the small cruelties that kept the powerful in their positions. "It's magnificent," Elira said softly, pressing her face to the carriage window. "I had forgotten how impressive it could be from a distance." "Distance has a way of hiding flaws," Therion replied, adjusting the crown that marked him as more than merely another nobleman seeking audience. "The closer one looks, the more cracks become visible." Their entry into the city had been carefully orchestrated. Rather than skulking through back alleys like fugitives, they approached openly, magnificently, with all the ceremony due to ancient nobility. The crown of shadows served as both symbol and weapon, a reminder that Therion's power predated the current royal line by centuries, that he commanded forces the court barely understood. Word of their arrival spread through the city like wildfire. Citizens lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the legendary vampire lord, their faces displaying the full spectrum of human emotion: fear, curiosity, awe, and, in some cases, surprising sympathy. The stories of his protection of Elira had grown in the telling, transforming from tale of supernatural corruption into romance of tragic devotion. "They're not all afraid," Elira observed, waving graciously to a group of women who called out blessings for her safety. "The common people understand injustice better than their betters," Therion replied. "They have lived it often enough to recognize it in others." The royal palace loomed before them, its white stone walls a stark contrast to the dark granite of Eld Hollow. Guards in ceremonial armor flanked the great gates, their expressions carefully neutral as Therion's carriage approached. Protocol demanded they show respect to his ancient title, even as fear of his nature made their hands drift toward their weapons. "Lord Therion of Eld Hollow," the captain of guards announced formally, "you are expected by Her Royal Highness Princess Catherine." The acknowledgement sent ripples through the gathered crowd. An audience with the king's daughter was no small matter, particularly for one who stood accused of harboring criminals. Therion allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he helped Elira from the carriage, noting how her simple elegance contrasted favorably with the overdressed courtiers who watched from palace windows. Princess Catherine received them in her private audience chamber, a room that managed to be both grand and intimate. She was a woman in her middle years, intelligent and composed, with the kind of beauty that came from strength of character rather than mere physical perfection. When Therion bowed formally, she gestured for him to rise with obvious respect. "Lord Therion," she said warmly, "it has been too long since you graced our court with your presence. And this must be Lady Elira, whose cause has stirred such passionate debate throughout the realm." "Your Highness," Elira replied with a perfect curtsy, "I am honored by your willingness to hear my case." "The honor is mine," Catherine said firmly. "I have not forgotten the debt I owe Lord Therion, nor my duty to ensure that justice prevails over political convenience. Please, both of you, be seated. We have much to discuss and little time to accomplish it." As they settled into comfortable chairs, arranged before the princess's desk, Therion felt the weight of centuries lift from his shoulders. Here was someone who would listen to evidence rather than prejudice, who valued truth over expedience. "I have reviewed the charges against Lady Elira," Catherine began, her expression growing grave. "The accusations are serious, but the evidence presented appears convenient. Too convenient, perhaps, for those who would benefit from her silence." "Your Highness is perceptive," Therion said carefully. "We have uncovered information that suggests a pattern of corruption extending far beyond this single case." "Show me," Catherine commanded, her royal authority unmistakable despite her gentle tone. For the next hour, they presented their evidence, methodically documents proving Richard's bribery, testimony from witnesses he had intimidated into silence, records showing the impossible timeline of Elira's supposed crimes. The princess listened with the attention of someone accustomed to weighing complex matters of state. "This is damning evidence against Lord Richard and his associates," Catherine said finally. "But presenting it to the tribunal will be problematic. They have already declared their intention to proceed with the execution, regardless of new evidence." "Then we must find another way," Therion said, feeling power flow through the crown of shadows as his determination hardened. "With your permission, Your Highness, I request the ancient right of trial by ordeal. Let divine judgment decide between truth and falsehood." The princess stared at him in amazement. "You would invoke the old laws? Submit yourself to supernatural trial? I would stake everything on the certainty that innocence will prevail over corruption," Therion replied. "The Crown of Shadows amplifies not just my power, but my connection to the fundamental forces of justice that govern this realm. If Richard and his allies are willing to face such judgment, let them do so." "They will never agree," Elira said softly. "They know their guilt too well." "Then their refusal becomes evidence of that guilt," Catherine observed shrewdly. "A brilliant strategy, Lord Therion. Public trial by ordeal would force them to either submit to certain exposure or reveal their cowardice before the entire court. The plan crystallized between them like ice forming on still water, dangerous, beautiful, and absolutely decisive. Therion felt the ancient power stirring within him, responding to righteous purpose and the love that drove him to risk everything for justice. The dawn crystal blazed like captured sunlight in the great hall of the royal palace, its golden radiance filling every corner of the vast chamber where the court had gathered to witness justice. Ancient magic flowed through the crystalline artifact, its power to reveal truth as legendary as its ability to grant vampires safe passage through daylight. Princess Catherine had retrieved it from the royal treasury at considerable personal risk, understanding that only the most sacred relics could command the respect necessary to ensure fair trial. Richard stood pale and trembling before the assembled nobles, his carefully constructed confidence crumbling as he faced the prospect of supernatural judgment. Behind him, the corrupt magistrate Lord Blackwood shifted nervously, while other conspirators melted into the crowd like shadows before dawn. They had expected legal maneuvering and political pressure, not the ancient laws that predated their influence and rendered their wealth meaningless. "The accused has invoked trial by ordeal," Princess Catherine announced to the silent hall. "By the old laws, his challenge must be answered or the charges dismissed. Lord Richard, do you accept judgment by the dawn crystal's light?" Therion stood motionless beside Elira, the crown of shadows amplifying his presence until he seemed to fill the great hall with quiet authority. The crystal responded to his proximity, its radiance growing stronger as if recognizing kindred power. He had gambled everything on this moment, his reputation, his safety, his very existence, trusting that truth would prove stronger than corruption. This is highly irregular," Richard stammered, his gaze darting desperately around the hall for allies who had suddenly become invisible. "Surely in our modern age, we need not resort to superstitious—" "The laws are clear," the king himself interrupted, his voice carrying absolute authority. He had arrived moments before, drawn by reports of the extraordinary proceedings. "Ancient privilege invoked properly cannot be denied. Answer the challenge, Lord Richard, or see the charges dismissed for lack of courage to face judgment." The trap was perfect and inescapable. To refuse would brand Richard a coward before the entire court, destroying his reputation and influence forever. To accept meant subjecting himself to examination by magical forces that would expose every lie, every bribe, every moment of corruption that had built his power. "Very well," Richard said finally, his voice barely audible. "I accept trial by crystal light." The dawn crystal pulsed brighter, responding to the formal acceptance of its authority. Princess Catherine gestured for the court scribe to record the proceedings, ensuring that whatever truth emerged would be documented for posterity. "Let the accused make his testimony," she commanded. Richard approached the crystal with obvious reluctance, each step seeming to require enormous effort. When he stood within its golden radiance, his face took on a sickly pallor that had nothing to do with the light's intensity. "I swear by this sacred crystal that Lady Elira attempted to poison my associates and threatened violence against lawful magistrates," he said, the words emerging like broken glass. The dawn crystal's light flickered, dimmed, then blazed with sudden fury that made the entire assembly gasp. Richard staggered backward as if struck, his face twisting with pain as the artifact's power coursed through him. "The crystal rejects false testimony," Princess Catherine observed coldly. "Speak truth, Lord Richard, or face the consequences of deception in the presence of sacred law." "I cannot," Richard began, then screamed as golden fire seemed to engulf his form. When it faded, he collapsed to his knees, all pretense of dignity abandoned. "It was lies, all lies. Elira spoke truth about our corruption, threatened to expose us. We fabricated evidence to silence her." The admission rang through the hall like thunder, followed by shocked murmurs from nobles who had believed Richard's version of events. Therion felt vindication flow through him like wine, sweet and warming after the bitter years of isolation. "Continue," the king commanded, his voice cold with royal displeasure. The truth poured from Richard like water from a broken dam. Years of bribery, intimidation, and abuse of power spilled out under the crystal's relentless illumination. Names of conspirators, details of corrupted trials, evidence of a network of crime that reached into the highest levels of court hierarchy. When Richard finally collapsed in exhausted confession, The dawn crystal's light softened to a gentle glow that seemed to bless rather than condemn. Princess Catherine approached Therion and Elira, her expression mixing triumph with profound relief. "The charges against Lady Elira are dismissed," she announced formally. "Lord Richard and his associates will face judgment for their crimes against justice and the crown. Lord Therion, your faith in ancient law has been vindicated." But Therion's attention had shifted to Elira, who stood bathed in the crystal's golden radiance with tears of joy streaming down her face. The light seemed to embrace her, confirming what he had always known, that she was innocent not just of crime, but of any darkness that might diminish her essential goodness. "It's over," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "No," he replied, drawing her close as the dawn crystal pulsed with renewed brilliance. "It's beginning." In the crystal's light, vampire and mortal stood together before the assembled court, their love no longer hidden but celebrated as the force that had brought justice to a corrupt realm. The ancient magic recognized what the nobles were only beginning to understand, that true power lay not in fear or manipulation, but in the courage to stand for what was right. As the great hall erupted in applause, Therion felt sunlight touch his skin for the first time in centuries, the dawn crystal's magic granting him a gift he had thought lost forever. In that moment of golden radiance, all things seemed possible. The wedding rings of eternal bond gleamed in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the great windows of Eld Hollow's restored chapel. Forged from silver mined in the mountains and obsidian drawn from the keep's ancient foundations, they represented the perfect union of light and shadow, mortal hope and immortal devotion. Therion turned the rings in his palm, marveling at how something so simple could carry such profound weight. 1 year had passed since that golden morning in the royal court when truth had triumphed over corruption. The seasons had turned full circle, bringing with them changes that would have seemed impossible during those dark winter nights when he had believed himself doomed to eternal solitude. Elira emerged from the keep's restored chambers, wearing a gown of midnight blue that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. Silver threads were woven through the fabric in patterns that caught the light like captured stars, and the moonstone pendant rested at her throat where it belonged. She was beautiful in the way that came from deep contentment, the glow of someone who had found her place in the world and made peace with all its complexities. "Are you ready?" she asked, taking his hand with the easy intimacy of shared purpose. "I have been ready for centuries," Therion replied, lifting her fingers to his lips. "I simply had to wait for you to arrive and teach me what I was waiting for." The chapel had been lovingly restored over the months following their return from the capital. What had been a cold stone shell filled with dust and memories was now a living space once again, with clear windows that let in natural light and fresh flowers growing in carefully tended boxes. The village priest, Father Marcus, a different man from Lord Marcus Ashworth, though equally valued, had travelled from the nearest settlement to perform the ceremony. A small gathering of guests had assembled to witness their union. Princess Catherine had made the journey from the capital, bringing with her the royal blessing that legitimized their marriage in the eyes of both crown and church. Lord Ashworth stood proudly among the witnesses, his weathered face bright with joy at seeing his friend's happiness. Even Henrik had returned, drawn by curiosity and genuine affection for the master he had once served. "Dearly beloved," Father Marcus began, his voice carrying the gravity appropriate to such a sacred moment, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Therion listened to the familiar words with wonder, remembering how empty such ceremonies had seemed during his centuries of isolation. Now they carried the weight of genuine meaning, each phrase acknowledging the miracle of two souls choosing to bind their fates together despite all the obstacles the world had placed in their path. "The rings, my lord," Father Marcus prompted gently. Therion took Elira's hand, sliding the silver and obsidian band onto her finger with reverent care. "With this ring, I thee wed, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. I promise to love you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days we are granted together. Elira's eyes shone with tears as she took the matching ring and placed it on his finger. With this ring, I thee wed, she replied, her voice carrying the same quiet certainty that had drawn him to her from the beginning. I promise to stand beside you, to see you truly, and to love you without reservation through whatever trials may come. By the power vested in me by God and the crown, Father Marcus declared, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, my lord. Their first kiss as married partners was gentle, reverent, full of promise and wonder. The assembled guests cheered softly, their applause echoing through the restored chapel like music. Princess Catherine stepped forward to offer her congratulations, her pleasure genuine and warm. The kingdom is richer for your happiness, she said, embracing Elira warmly. Your courage in seeking justice has inspired reforms that will protect others from the corruption you faced. It was true. Richard's confessions had led to sweeping changes in the court system, new protections for those who exposed wrongdoing, and a renewed commitment to ensuring that justice remained blind to wealth and influence. Elira had become something of a folk hero, her story told around hearth fires as evidence that truth would ultimately prevail. But for Therion, the greatest transformation was not in the kingdom but in himself. The keep of Eld Hollow had awakened from its long slumber, becoming once again a place of life and warmth. They had opened their doors to travelers and scholars, offering sanctuary to those who needed it and wisdom to those who sought it. The vampire lord had become a protector in the truest sense, using his power to shield the vulnerable rather than inspire fear. As evening approached and their guests departed, Therion and Elira stood together on the battlements, watching the sun set over the no longer haunted woods. The trees whispered with natural wind rather than supernatural dread, and lights twinkled in the distance from villages that had grown prosperous under their protection. "Do you ever regret it?" Elira asked, leaning against his side. "Trading your solitary existence for all the complications that come with caring about the world again?" Therion considered the question seriously, as he always did her thoughtful inquiries. "I regret the centuries I wasted believing that isolation was safety," he said finally. "I regret the fear I allowed to rule my choices, the good I might have done if I had found courage sooner, but regret our life together? Never." She smiled, the expression lighting her face like sunrise. "Good, because we have much work ahead of us. Lord Ashworth sent word that there are other cases of corruption that need investigating, other innocents who need champions. Then we shall be their champions," Therion agreed, finding joy in the prospect of purpose shared with the woman he loved. Together, as we have always been meant to be. The wedding rings caught the last light of day, silver and obsidian united in perfect harmony. In the distance, a new day was already beginning somewhere in the world, full of possibilities and challenges that would test their love and strengthen their resolve. But whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it hand in hand, heart to heart, two souls who had found in each other the courage to choose light over darkness, love over fear, hope over despair.